We are here, and as always, we're excited, and I know I've said it. I'm extra excited, but I really am extra excited about this evening's topic, the flying Africans, and I have to, in opening this live stream, I have to acknowledge my ancestors and all of our ancestors who were um, enslaved souls brought from the mother country of Africa, a Kibulon, and brought onto the shores of mostly the coastal islands of Georgia and South Carolina. And so this evening we're going to be talking about the Georgia coastal islands and this story of the flying Africans. And it really touches my soul because the story that we're going to hear about happened on St. Simon's Island, and just right across the water are where my paternal people are from, Sapelo Island, where Belali Muhammad, the only uh, enslaved soul who was brought from West Africa as a prince, uh, was brought to Sapelo Island, allowed to keep his Muslim name and to continue to practice his Muslim faith. And so I grew up hearing and knowing about the flying Africans. And so I'm excited. I'm trying not to give too much away, but how are you feeling, Sister Kara?
I 100% share your excitement. This story has meant so much. In fact, I was just talking with my dad about this and saying how I've gotten to the point after so many years of engaging with it that I don't really refer to it as a story anymore. I call it a narrative because I think for a lot of people, story indicates fiction. And
Yeah.
this narrative goes beyond that, I think, for so many of our people and our family stories and so forth. It worked its way into my graduate thesis. So I love it. I'm so excited to be talking about this tonight.
I am too, and I'm today all day, and I even talked to some of my relatives on Sapelo over the weekend, and um, I had a even if they were cousins, in the African tradition, in our culture, the older people, even if they were a cousin, they're an aunt, right, or an uncle, and so I had an older cousin who would later, I guess, they said, would experience dementia. But she spoke a lot. I grew up conversating and engaging with nature, and many of those old traditions were passed down to me. And so, in her older age, and she lived to be almost 100, if not 100. But our backyard faces the ocean, um, and she would always be looking up because she was one of the ones who passed that story down many generations. Um, and so I tonight I'm full because she was not that lost in whatever happens with dementia, but she would go and look to the sky and remember. And that is what I remember most about her. So, with that being said, Sister Kara, uh, the room is yours. We'll see you on the other side.
All right, thank you. Well, welcome to everyone who's joining us tonight. As we've said, we are so excited for this session, and I am excited to introduce to you a returning guest to the Live Black Experience Community Dialogues, Dr. Joy Jager. Dr.
Hi.
Jager, good evening. By way of introduction, Dr. Giguere is an associate professor of history at Penn State York, where she teaches courses on early and modern American history, the Civil War and Reconstruction eras, medical history, history of technology, African American history, and the history of death and mourning. Her research centers on American commemorative culture with a two-pronged focus on the rural cemetery movement of the 19th century and the public art and memory of the Civil War. She earned her bachelor's in anthropology and music from Bowdoin College in Maine in 2003, her master's in historical archaeology and PhD in history, both from the University of Maine in 2005 and 2009. She is the author of Characteristically American, National Identity, Memorial Architecture, and the Egyptian Revival, published by the University of Tennessee Press in 2014, and is currently working on Pleasure Grounds of Death, Society, Culture, and the Rural Cemetery in 19th Century America, to be published by the University of Michigan Press this year. Her articles on rural cemeteries, cemetery monuments, and the Confederate monuments have been published in the Journal of Southern History, the Public Historian, the Journal of the Early Republic, the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, Material Culture, Ohio Valley History, and Markers, the annual journal for the Association for Gravestone Studies. Welcome again, Dr. Giguere.
Thanks so much for having me back, Kara. So if you would mind controlling the PowerPoint for me tonight, and I'll just let you know when we want to go forward each slide. So it's wonderful to be back for the Black Lived Experience program. It's always such a really fulfilling experience to come and speak with you and engage with the audience. So tonight I've been asked to talk a bit about the legend and legacy of the Flying Africans. And I like how Kara was describing this for her personally more as a narrative. So I kind of feel as though I should alter this this first slide and say the narrative and legacy of the Flying Africans. So if we could go forward the next slide. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about where we get Flying Africans from. And so the reference to Flying Africans originates with an event that took place in spring of 1803. And it was at this time that a group of captive, alternatively referred to as Ebo, or Igbo, from Nigeria, about 100 of them arrived on a slave ship to Savannah, Georgia, where they were brought to the market, the slave market, and they were put on sale, as was very typical during this period of time. And what's interesting here is that it was already by the early 19th century kind of well known amongst the planter class that the Igbo of Nigeria, they were notorious for their resistance to chattel slavery. They were a very proud people, a very strong-willed people, and many amongst the planter class kind of avoided purchasing members of the Igbo clan. And this is something that we see happening in the course of the transatlantic slave trade, which dates back to the 1500s, where we have these different areas of West Africa where the slave-owning planter class in the Western Hemisphere, they associate particular qualities with different populations that were taken captive and then sold in the West. And so these are the associations that were made with the Igbo. But nevertheless, despite the negative associations that they would fight back against enslavement, we have about 100 of these individuals who were purchased by agents John Cooper and Thomas Spalding, who were purchasing these enslaved persons to then transport them to St. Simon's Island to labor on the plantation there. And it's at this point that things go sideways in terms of the plans to have these newly purchased enslaved persons go and labor on the plantation. So while they were on board the ship headed to St. Simon's Island, there was a rebellion. About 75 out of the 100 enslaved Eboes rebelled. And in the course of the rebellion, Cooper and Spalding end up fleeing the ship. They jump into the water and they drown. The ship then runs aground on St. Simon's, actually at Dunbar Creek. And the captives, they come off of the ship, and in a collective act of resistance, they walk into Dunbar Creek. And we have different accounts of what ultimately happens to these individuals who walk into Dunbar Creek. So a firsthand observer, a white man named Roswell King, wrote that the captives took to the swamp and that they committed collective suicide and drowned in the creek. And it was King who was the person who ultimately ended up trying to recover the bodies of those who were drowned. And he only managed to recover about 13 of those bodies. And so there are various versions of this story that take shape. Now, from the position of King, who worked who was a manager for the plantation, he saw it as this mass suicide represented a financial loss for the purchasers. But for survivors and progeny going forward over the course of time, the narrative took on a very different cast. So if we can go forward to the next slide, please. Thank you. So if we look at African American oral tradition in this area of coastal Georgia and a little bit further north in coastal South Carolina, we have a long oral tradition that states an alternative version of events. Not that they didn't walk into Dunbar Creek, but that they didn't necessarily drown or die. Now, if we look at this very important publication that was the result of the Federal Writers Project, which was funded during the 1930s as part of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal program under the Works Progress Administration, writers and historians were sent around the country in order to collect what were called the slave narratives. And the slave narratives involved interviewing formerly enslaved people who were still alive in the 1930s. And so this means that at this point in time, the youngest people that they were interviewing were at that stage in their 80s. And many of the individuals that they interviewed for the narratives were in their 90s and even hundreds. And for the interviews that they collected in coastal Georgia, these were collected together in the book Drums and Shadows, Survival Studies Among the Georgia Coastal Negroes. And we have many individuals who speak of what they know, what they knew about what happened at Dunbar Creek, which over time came to be called Eboes Landing because it involved the mass suicide of these Eboes. So we have some individuals who explicitly say that they drowned. One individual, Floyd Wright, said, "Heard about the Eboes Landing? That's the place where they bring the Eboes over in a slave ship. And when they get here, they ain't like it. They ain't like it. And so they all start singing and they march right down in the river to march back to Africa. But they ain't able to get there. They gets drowned." And this is one of the few accounts that the oral history says they drowned. They didn't go back to Africa, they drowned. But many of the accounts in here state otherwise, that they walked into the water and instead of drowning, they traveled back to Africa through the water. They either walked on the water and returned to Africa, or they flew across the water back to Africa. And it's that theme of flight that gives us the idea and the narrative of the flying Africans. So Wallace Quarterman is another former enslaved person who said, "Ain't you heard about them?" Well, at that time, Mr. Blue, he was the overseer. And Mr. Blue, he go down one morning with a long whip for to whip them good. Anyway, he whipped them good, and they got together and stuck that hoe in the field, and then rose up in the sky and turned themselves into buzzards and flew right back to Africa. Everybody knows about them. So here we have another version of this event where not only did they fly back to Africa, but they transformed into birds, specifically buzzards, in order to do so. If we can go to the next slide, please. Now, another man, James Moore, said, "I seen folks disappear right before my eyes, just go right out of sight. They do say that people brought from Africa in slavery times could disappear and fly right back to Africa. From the things I see myself, I believe that they could do this." And this is one theme that we see repeated in a number of the accounts, that people saw it for themselves, not necessarily at Eboes Landing, but this was a pattern that occurred throughout the region where discontented enslaved men and women would take off in flight and disappear. Jack Wilson said, "Some people have magic power, what come to them from way back in Africa. My mother escape and fly back to Africa." And this is another idea that Africa was a magical place, and that for those from Africa were imbued with a particular type of animist magic that allowed them to do things that defy the laws of physics and run counter to everything that Westerners understood to be true. Another man, Uncle Jonah, said, "I remember hearing about a boatload what was brung from Africa. When they let them out and they see they wasn't in Africa, they just take wing and fly back home." If we can go forward one more, please. And then here we have a fascinating account that comes secondhand. So a man named Prince Snead retold a story that was told to him by his grandmother. And so he said, "My grand say old man Waldberg down on St. Catherine owned some slaves what wasn't climatized, and he worked them hard, and one day they wasn't hoeing in the field, and the driver come out, and they say, 'Kumbaba yali kumbaba tambe, kumkunka yali kumkunka tambe,' quick like. Then they rise off the ground and fly away. Nobody ever see them no more. Some say they fly back to Africa. My grand see that with his own eye." And so again, we have that assertion that somebody had seen it for themselves. And thus it has to be true, that this isn't a myth, it isn't a legend, this isn't a tale, that this was something that people could verify with firsthand knowledge. Now, there's a text, there's a book called Bantu Speaking Heritage of the United States by Winifred Voss. And what's interesting is how there is a heritage of Bantu speaking peoples who dominated across most of the regions of West Africa, where we see these Bantu-based dialects, linguistic dialects, that end up being translated and reworked within the New World context. We see the syncretic new language known as Gullah, which involves the combination of various West African dialects with Portuguese and English. And we continue to hear the language Gullah spoken today by the Gullah Gutchi people on the island, in the coastal islands of South Carolina. And in her book, that spoken word that comes from Prince Snead can be derived from a Luba proverb that in Bantu says, "Kumabuba yandi, kumabuba natambe, kunakonku yandi, kunakonku natambe," which roughly translates into English as, "He is tricky, so I will win by being tricky too. He asks clever questions, so I will win by using clever questions too." And in this translation, we can see how it connects back to West African folk tales regarding trickster tales, where you have basically a larger, dumb animal or other creature who is an oppressor, and they are outsmarted by a smaller, weaker but more intelligent trickster character. And the trickster element here is tricking the slave owner by flying away, by taking flight and leaving in the most unexpected of ways. If you could go forward, please. So this kind of leaves us with a big question then. Did these flying Africans in reality defy the laws of physics and take flight? Or was flying a metaphor for another kind of flight? Was it a metaphor for running away, or was it a metaphor for self-destruction through suicide? And we do see that running throughout the history of American slavery. Enslaved Africans and African Americans resisted bondage through a variety of ways. So one form of resistance was outright violence and rebellion. And we see this happening in the 300 years of the transatlantic slave trade. Over 2,000 cases of onboard rebellions that resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths over the course of 300 years. And we also see on plantations the enslaved rising up in rebellion. In the 18th century, we have cases in the colonies of African-born men leading rebellions to seek vengeance against their enslavers for their bondage. In the case of Saint-Domingue, which eventually becomes Haiti, we have the world's only major successful slave rebellion that results in emancipation and then independence from imperial control, in this case, control by the French. And in the 19th century, the most profound example of a slave rebellion is the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831, in which Nat Turner experienced visions from God and believed that God told him to fight the serpent, meaning slavery. And so he, along with fellow slaves on his plantation and other neighboring plantations, set out to destroy slave owners and thus the institution. And over the course of several days, killed about 55 white people before they were caught. And a couple of months later, Nat Turner, he was ultimately imprisoned, put on trial, hanged, and then skinned. And we don't really see much in the way of large-scale slave rebellions after the Nat Turner Rebellion, but that's another story. So we see rebellion as a common theme. But for most enslaved Africans and African Americans, we see either an effort to make accommodations to live and persist and survive within their bondage, or to find other ways to push back. We see flight in terms of running away. And of course, this is a very common theme in 19th century histories of slavery, particularly with the Underground Railroad. We also see smaller scale efforts at pushing back against bondage through silent sabotage. So silent sabotage included a variety of methods to kind of push back at the system without being overt, without doing anything that would merit getting in trouble and perhaps being subjected to corporal punishment, such as whipping. So it could be things such as pretending to be sick, or playing dumb, or stealing little things that wouldn't necessarily be missed, pretending to misunderstand orders, and so on and so forth. Like I said, little things to push back against the system. And then we do have suicide. Now, suicide was a well-documented issue in the transatlantic slave trade. And in the 1790s, according to ship's physicians' records, approximately 7.2% of captives committed suicide while on ships. And that's only during the 1790s. So we can extrapolate across 300 years that there were large numbers of enslaved people who either successfully committed suicide just during the Middle Passage, or at least attempted suicide. And one of the illustrations that we see here on this particular slide on the left is an illustration of what's called a speculum oris. And this was a tool that was kept on board on all of the ships to use for those who were enslaved who tried to commit suicide through self-starvation. The speculum oris was a mechanism that would be placed in the mouth in order to force the mouth and throat open so that the person could be force-fed and thus kept alive. Another method for attempting suicide while on slave ships was to throw oneself overboard into the ocean to either drown, swim, or be eaten by sharks. And this became such a problem that most ship captains on slave ships, they put up netting along the sides of the ships so that those captives who attempted to throw themselves overboard would simply be caught up in the nets and then they'd be brought back on board. So we can clearly see that there are patterns in the Middle Passage during the transatlantic slave trade where efforts at self-destruction were significant enough that captains and crew, they were making provisions to ensure that those captives were not successfully killing themselves. Now, the records for self-destruction through suicide once on land, those become a bit thinner and harder to track. And part of it has to do with the fact that, if we go forward to the next slide, please. The Western Christian tradition, since the Middle Ages, had placed an incredible taboo on suicide. So to understand kind of the disappearance of suicide amongst the enslaved in the American colonies and later United States, we have to kind of shift gears a little bit and wrap our heads around Judeo-Christian attitudes towards suicide. So since the Middle Ages, suicide was regarded as an act of self-murder. So this is from the idea that the body, the physical body, is the vessel that holds your immortal soul, which is owned not by you, but by God. God owns your soul, and God also owns your body. God created your body as the vessel to hold your soul and to protect your soul. And to destroy your own body willfully is an affront to God. And so this is where we get the idea of suicide as self-murder. Now, within the Christian tradition in medieval Europe, and really lasting through the 18th century, self-murder came with multiple negative ramifications. One was the belief in the damnation of the soul. If you have committed such an affront to God, this was a serious sin against God, that there is no possibility for heavenly salvation if you commit suicide. And as an extension of that, Christian burial could be and often was denied to those who were known to have committed suicide. So from the Middle Ages on, we have the importance of, a proper Christian burial took place in consecrated ground. And consecrated ground is the ground that is blessed by priests and is the yard, the burying ground next to a church, the churchyard. And those who were not allowed to be buried on consecrated ground included executed criminals, the unbaptized infants, but they were not regarded as damned, more that they were going to be stuck in limbo, and they might get buried in like the northwest corner, which was the less good corner, but still consecrated ground. But then also suicides, they don't get to be buried in consecrated ground. In England, it was a common practice that suicides, they would be buried at crossroads. So you knew them by their burial location. Suicides could also face desecration or mutilation of their bodies after death. So to further indicate their shame and dishonor of what they had done. And then there could also be negative ramifications for living survivors. There could be financial and social penalties for surviving relatives. So the suicide taboo applies not just to those who committed self-murder, but it also extended to their families as well. So we have this Christian tradition emerging from the Middle Ages that survives during the colonial period in North America and persists well into the 18th and even into through much of the 19th centuries. And so in those instances where presumably the enslaved may have likely committed suicide, it was in the best interests of their enslavers to cover up suicide, to make it look like an accident, because if it got out that it was known that a slave had committed suicide, then that could reflect poorly on the master. That what had the master done to create such conditions that would lead an enslaved person to commit suicide? And so there is an element of shame that would be attached to the slave-owning master class if it got out that their slaves are killing themselves rather than being enchained to chattel bondage. If we could go to the next slide, please. Now, we don't see those same kinds of taboos associated with suicide in West African religious traditions. So while, as we heard mentioned earlier, we have many West Africans who had converted to Islam. But we also, during the period of the transatlantic slave trade, also have, a sizable majority of West Africans who continue to practice traditional polytheistic animism. So this is a belief in multiple deities, and also that everything within the earth contains a spirit, and that includes both living and non-living things. That includes animals and people, but also rocks and trees and plants. And through West African spiritual traditions and practices in a number of areas of West Africa, we see certain practices such as spirit possession, so the calling upon certain deities and spirits to come into the body of an individual and thus manifest through them in order to speak to people and to take requests and to give blessings. And we also see the belief in some areas of the transmigration of souls, that, in other words, reincarnation. In the context of the transatlantic slave trade, where we have enslaved Africans who are moving to the Caribbean and Brazil and North America, there's a persistence of aspects of polytheistic animism and the religious ritualistic practices that manifested in West Africa. But we also see a perpetuation of the belief that the souls of the dead would ultimately return to Africa. And so there's the idea of the sacredness of water, and that the soul would travel over water across the Atlantic Ocean back to the homeland of Africa. And not having the suicide taboo, there's no sense of eternal damnation in the face of self-destruction, but rather that it is a release from bondage. It is a liberation. It is a liberatory act. And if we think about the nature of race-based slavery in the United States, this is an institution that seeks to strip human beings of their very humanity, of their identity, and of all sense of agency. And suicide is an ultimate act of agency. It is an ultimate act of resistance, of very self-conscious action. I would rather die and let my soul return to Africa than stay here and be enslaved. If we could go forward, please. Now, what's interesting here is that while we know that suicide happened, we don't know exact numbers in terms of how many enslaved Africans and African Americans once on land actually did commit suicide. By the time we get to the 19th century, we see a great deal of denial from both white Americans and Black Americans about the idea that any African Americans while enslaved had killed themselves. But these ideas come from very different directions. So during the 19th century, Euro Americans embrace attitudes that African Americans did not suffer pain, either physical or emotional or mental pain. They did not suffer from depression or despair, and they did not suffer from mental illness. Now, there were white Americans who accused certain African Americans of being crazy and thus resulting in institutionalization in asylums. But there was this prevailing idea that African Americans did not feel pain the way that whites do. And so they did not take seriously the notion that the burdens of enslavement and the pain of enslavement and of having family members torn away from each other or women being raped by their white enslavers, that did not cause trauma and pain as it would white people. And so there is a denial amongst Euro Americans that African Americans could not possibly commit suicide. They could not possibly commit self-destruction because they don't feel pain the way white people do. We feel mental illness, we feel depression, we feel trauma, and that can help to explain when white folks commit suicide. But Black people committing suicide, that just doesn't happen. This is the idea here. And amongst post-emancipation generations of African Americans, as we've already seen in those quotes from Dust and Shadows, there is an insistence well into the 20th century that no, they were not committing suicide. They weren't killing themselves as an act of resistance or as an act of despair, but that they literally flew away. And I've been thinking and meditating a lot about the insistence on, flight rather than suicide. And if we look at the religious atmosphere for Americans, white and Black, during the 19th century, and the Second Great Awakening, which is a period of time where we have evangelical religious revivals happening all across the country. And many of the converted during that period of time, which was roughly 1800 to 1850, included both free and enslaved African Americans. Evangelical Christianity preached spiritual equality, that all people are equal in the eyes of God. And it was a very attractive message for African Americans, particularly for the enslaved, because it offered a message of hope that even if you are oppressed in this life, then in the afterlife, God sees you as equal. And it also, the message of evangelicalism is that everyone has within themselves the power of eternal salvation. And so it grants power to the powerless. And so we see huge numbers of African Americans in the 19th century, in the first half of the 19th century, converting to Christianity, where we really don't see quite as many embracing Christianity during the 18th century. And through those high conversion rates, I think in part, those prevailing suicide taboos, they kind of go right in there as well. And so it is much more logical if you have embraced Christianity and its various aspects to then look askance at suicide and look at it more as a negative action in that Christian tradition. And so we have this insistence on the flying Africans, that they took flight like birds and flew back to Africa and disappeared. If we can go forward, please. Thank you. So I think I erroneously, I didn't change the slide. I have myth on this slide. We shouldn't call it a myth. I'm not sure if we can call it a legend entirely. Again, it exists in kind of this narrative liminal space of what is true versus untrue, what is real, what is metaphor. But there is clearly a deep resonance in African American culture moving forward through the 20th century, in looking back upon the generations of those who were enslaved and who fought against their bondage in a variety of ways. And the flying Africans is an idea that, you know, persists to the present day. And we see it in literature. And I have on this slide probably three of the most well-known examples where we see the theme of the flying Africans. We have Toni Morrison's novel Song of Solomon, where one of her characters flies away. Then we have The People Could Fly, which is a collection of American Black folk tales by Virginia Hamilton. And then we have a children's book, Imani and the Flying Africans. So there's a literary tradition that carries forth the flying Africans. But the flying Africans is rooted in the very real narrative of what happened at Eboes Landing. So if we can go forward again. And we see in very recent performing arts and fine arts references to the, whether you call it flying Africans of Eboes Landing or the mass suicide and mass drowning of those who resisted bondage at Eboes Landing, we see references to this. And I read most recently that some look to the music video for Love Drought by Beyonce in her visual, her visual, I want to say record because I'm an old person now, album, that's the word I'm looking for, her visual album Lemonade. There are scenes that show her along with several other women, as we see in these screenshots here, walking into waters that could very easily be the coastal islands of Georgia or South Carolina. We have the moss-covered trees. We have them walking through the water, standing in the water. And there are some sources that look to this video as kind of hearkening to and invoking the spirit of Eboes Landing. And then we also have artists, as in visual artists, if we can go forward, who have worked to commemorate and try to visualize the acts of self-destruction rather than living in human bondage. So here we have charcoal on paper works by the Jamaican artist Don Nelson, showing individuals submerging themselves in water. If we can go to the next slide, please. And then the artist Dee Williams in 2016, she painted this large-scale work called Igbo Landing. And so we see a variety of people in various stages of entering into the water. And then finally, if we go to our last slide, we have most recently by the artist Chima Ikeguono, also called Igbo Landing. And this one, this particular painting is striking because we have basically the whole narrative appearing within the singular painting. So in the front of the painting, we can see, you know, the captives who are on the slave ship, but then we have that act of resistance of the Eboes walking into the water of Dunbar Creek in order to drown. So these are, you know, this brings us right up to 2020. The history of Eboes Landing and the story of flying Africans is something that has a 218-year history now. That it exists in both legend and reality, history and folklore. And regardless of what we choose to call it, it is a profound aspect of our shared history and culture. And in 2002, A group gathered together, including a group of Nigerians, at Eboes Landing in order to sanctify the space. But there is yet today, as far as I know, no permanent monument or memorial or marker that tells of what happened at Eboes Landing. And so this remains one of those understudied and undervalued aspects of the American past and of African American history. So I hope that this PowerPoint presentation tonight was helpful in kind of opening up a bit of the narrative and the historical context for better understanding Eboes Landing and flying Africans. And I haven't been looking at the comments this whole time, but I think now it's time for us to have our Q&A discussion. So thank you very much for everyone who tuned in and listened in.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And it is very much that time for us to start our conversation and talk about this narrative in terms of the Black lived experience, which is what we are here for. So I want to start by actually going to Miss Brnadine, if you don't mind me turning it over to you a little bit, just with your sharing of the legacy of your family and Sapelo Island, and knowing that this story is one that, or this narrative is one that has made its way across those islands and through the Gullah diaspora onto the mainland and into the rest of America. Where have you seen this narrative in your life? Was it one that was kind of told through your family, or how familiar with this were you growing up and even now?
It was in that backyard that I referred to in the opening that the elders, should not say the older, the elders claimed that day you could see, and you could have witnessed what happened, because St. Simon's is right in my front yard. I can look across the water and see St. Simon's Island. So, you and I, we were in the background talking about, I call her the Empress, Toni Morrison, and what she said about myth. This is not a myth. If people are talking about it, there is some truth to it. And I just grew up, and one day I probably need to write my book witnessing my family still very much practiced those African traditions. And so I don't want to get deep and scare people off, but we still practice our African traditions, and we still communicate with our ancestors, and our ancestors do indeed answer us back if we speak to them in the proper way, and if we treat them well and invite them to reside with us and to abide with us. So it was not a myth growing up, and to be able to still now to go stand, even if I did not see it in that moment, but to have heard and grew up hearing the description of it. There are many days that I could go stand at that same spot, and I can see that we do fly. We can fly. We have flown.
We started out the conversation, and Dr. Giguere, you referenced it in your presentation, the narratives that were collected in Drums and Shadows in that collection. And one of the things that really stood out to me as I was reading through that was All of the flying African narratives, there's at least 25 captured within that work. But so many of them were very much specifically linked to family members or known acquaintances. I saw my grandmother or my mother fly away. I saw a man walk up a tree and he was gone.
Yeah.
And so those types of narratives. And I'm really glad that both of you brought up Song of Solomon and Toni Morrison. There's a quote from her when she was doing an interview about Song of Solomon, where she said, "If it means Icarus to some readers, fine, but my meaning was specific. It is about Black people who could fly." So we talk a lot these days about believing Black voices and the importance of that. And so I'm wondering, how might we look at this narrative in particular as one that points to that same cross-cultural need to suspend that disbelief when engaging with the lived experiences of Black people or those who share this narrative in particular?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it is, like I said, I think it challenges us to think about, to rethink what we take for granted as what is possible in reality. As far as, the white Western tradition is concerned, you can't defy the laws of physics. People don't just sprout wings and fly. And yet, we have so many of these personal accounts and narratives that say, I've seen this happen. And I think it speaks to a larger issue of, as you mentioned, believing Black voices, believing what Black people and non-white people in general, what they have to say. And very often there's that element of disbelief, whether it has to do with something like this in terms of flying Africans, or going to a doctor and saying, I feel pain, and encountering medical disbelief of, I saw somewhere, I was scrolling through the comments here, that, that element of still not being believed, that's perpetuated today in so many different contexts. You didn't see what you say you saw. You didn't feel what you say you felt. And oftentimes the ramification is that people end up being hurt or dying because of disbelief. And so, whether or not you believe in the capacity for human flight, it's still necessary to take these oral histories as an important piece of the collective narrative of the Black experience in the United States, that this is integral to the identity of so many people. And that would be like, for the same as questioning, any number of other people's personal beliefs that they embrace as true, but that others might believe exist within the realm of superstition or fantasy or folklore.
Thank you for that. Speaking of folklore, that was actually going to be one of the next questions I had, because we opened up and I was sharing how I've started referring to this more as a narrative than story, because story implies fiction, versus the idea that this could be a true narrative for members of the Black community. And another thing that stood out to me was, as I was reading different works that were talking about this narrative, there were many that put this narrative in the realm of folklore. And one of the works that I was looking at really called out part of why I find it so hard to accept that or use that terminology, because of some of the historical definitions of folklore that basically relied upon the assumption that the narratives were those of and these are terms that were used in some of the original definitions of folklore. They were the narratives of backwards people, or they were the narratives of the less cultured classes. In other words, it assumed ignorance on the part of those who shared these narratives. So instead of looking at these narratives and the narratives of flying Africans as oral traditions of ignorance, how can we look at them more in terms of Bernard Bell's definition of folklore, which was the creative expression of the people, by the people, for the people?
Boy. I don't even know how to start to approach that one. Brnadine, do you have thoughts?
You know, I do not, I guess because I'm so deeply rooted in this as my truth, as a descendant of these souls, I'm not able to comprehend anything else, other than this is our truth.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Well, sorry.
no, so no, go ahead.
No, listening, it helps me organize my thoughts listening to you. And, thinking of it historically, as a historian, I think perhaps the simplest way to regard it is simply as this is oral history. And oral history can be separated from the realm of folk tale, can be separated from the realm of the mythic, because it is, the oral accounts that are handed down generation by generation, and they might vary with the telling over the course of time. And that's why we see so many different variations on this, of people bodily taking flight or transforming into animals or climbing up a tree and disappearing. We see many variations on this, but they are oral accounts that are handed down from those who experienced it and witnessed it to their descendants. And we have oral histories that are critical to historical scholarship and historical narratives from all across the world, because when we think about, the written word is not universal. In most times and places across the globe, all history, all knowledge was transmitted orally. And so, I think we have to take it for what it is, that these are oral accounts that are handed down, that these are part of people's lived experiences and part of people's heritage, such as yourself.
I, but there's something still there that leans towards this may not be true. Rather, reporters and writers would come to Saplo quite often to interview us. And I can recall my uncle responding to this, to our story of the flying Africans. And it came out of nowhere. And when Kara talked about, we supposedly the people who were uneducated or some level of ignorance, and my uncle was not college educated, but he said, you he asked the reporter, have you ever seen those movies with Bruce Lee? And the reporter said yes. And he said, and you see Bruce Lee and what he does with his body, and you, well, how would you describe it? and my uncle put it back on the writer, and the writer said, well, it is almost as though he could fly. And my uncle said, almost? What do you see when you're watching Bruce Lee in these movies? And we have these stories. No one questions the ninjas who walk on water. So why would it be impossible for Africans to be able to fly?
You know, what stands out to me so much in this is this the distinction between the traditional Western and what's accepted in traditional Western culture, and that realm of understanding, and a narrative like this that in so many ways defies all of that, in the same way that the narrative itself is about defying a Western institution that was put upon the people involved. There was an interesting argument that I read in another article that suggested that the flying African narrative can be read as more than justifying the Western laws of physics, but deeper, rejecting the very Western scientific, legal, and philosophical ideologies that justified slavery. So I'm curious about your either of your or both of your thoughts on that.
Go ahead.
Had a conversation recently. Here is what happens when we get so caught up in religion as opposed to being spiritual. Our senses will not allow us to go beyond what we can actually see, feel, hear, and smell, as though we are not connected to something much, much deeper than that. And I think what has happened is, and I know that because I see it every day, especially when it comes to this lived Black experience, that I could sit here and tell you that I have seen people fly, and that indeed I can fly, and you will say and whisper, she's crazy. No, she can't. She's lying. Because we've been so ingrained with not thinking beyond what you can actually see, smell, hear, or taste. And we come from a people who were so connected to spirit before we were enslaved souls brought to those Georgia and South Carolina coastal islands. And all of that was taken from us for a reason. And we never want to talk about that. And I see someone mentioned about Yeshua walking on water. We don't want to talk about that. And we call it a miracle, when indeed he was of those sacred people who indeed could walk on water. But Western culture strips all of that away, and it tells us or teaches us or almost wants to force us to bow down to the belief that if you didn't see it, if you can't touch it, if you can't taste it, smell it, it is not real. And whereas being spiritual calls us to be above those five senses and I know for a fact that I am of those people who work, live, exist, who are, who be, who is beyond those five senses. And so I still maintain that we did fly, we do fly, we be flying, and we still can fly.
I want to go to the comments because there have been several that kind of point towards the same line of thought. There was a comment that Miss Brnadine, you referenced, saying no one questions that Jesus walked on water. A later comment says Jonah lived in a whale for 3 days. There was the narrative of Lot's wife who is turned into a pillar of salt. And in the collection, Drums and Shadows, there's one of the narratives where one of the people of the islands points this out as well. Of, this is narratives that are coming from the same people who were there when Moses turned a staff into a snake, and all of these things were happening in Egypt. And it was never questioned. And yet, when it comes to this sort of a narrative, there's something about it that just seems so beyond comprehension that it's more easily dismissed. And so that's part of what we're, I think, talking about and battling against in this conversation is this is more than myth, and it's more than the stories of people who don't understand the world that they're living in. It seems to be more of the narrative of people who very much understood the world that they were living in, but the incomprehension of a more, again, that Western perspective, if we want to pinpoint it there. Dr. Giguere, I want to give you the opportunity to speak into any of this as well.
Yeah, I think part of the issue here is that we have become so colonized in our thinking, so that, everything is through the lens of the Western perception. And thus, it is virtually impossible the challenge is to decolonize our thinking and be able to understand people's thoughts and behaviors and beliefs and actions on their own ground and through their own eyes and experiences and traditions, rather than through the lens of white Western interpretation. And so, the article that you mentioned, Kara, that says, this represents a rejection of Western legality and science, and I can't remember the exact quote that you said, but why would they embrace that in the first place? If you're being forcibly placed into a situation where you're coming from a completely different social and cultural and religious environment, it's not even rejecting the Western traditions. They're still completely unacquainted with the Western traditions. So how is it a rejection if on the point of arrival, without any acculturation, without any assimilation, there's simply a matter of rejecting the circumstance and thus doing whatever is necessary and possible to return home and to use the methods that are available in order to accomplish that. And I think it's interesting, these comments that are coming out saying, we so many Americans totally accept the biblical narrative and biblical tradition, but the biblical narrative has also been colonized. we have ingrained in our heads, the lily white Jesus, who walked on water, not a black Jesus, not a brown Jesus who walked on water, but a white Jesus who walked on water. And that is somehow more believable. That everything out of the Bible is somehow more believable than the actions that are described in the West African spiritual and cultural traditions that bear striking similarities.
I want to go back to the comments, and I apologize for anyone if I've missed something that you said. I usually have a separate window open with the live comments so I can kind of keep track of them. Right now, I'm scrolling our background chat version of your comments. But earlier in the conversation, several audience members were making reference to traditional spirituals that referenced the idea of flight. One was the familiar words of the hymn, "Before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free." There was another referenced earlier, "Now let me fly" is another one someone else stated in the comments. And so I want to go back to that persistent representation of flight and flying in Black narratives and poetry, literary forms in these songs. I'd like to talk just a little bit about what this narrative and the narrative of Igbo landing tells us about the lived Black experience of simply resiliency. You talked, Dr. Giguere, a bit about the understandings of suicide, and from the Western perspective, it being self-destruction versus the African perspective of this is freedom. This is how I escape these bonds, is by making this choice. And in that idea of flight, that I'll fly away. One bright morning, you'll look up and I'll be gone. Even in songs like, I think it's Summertime, where it says, one of these mornings you're going to rise up singing and you'll spread your wings and take to the sky. Yep. This is a persistent image that speaks of this constant opportunity for freedom through flight. So can we just talk about either of your perspectives on that?
Yeah, I mean, flight, whether it was physical flight, running away, fleeing, or flight as in flying, or flight as in the soul's flight over the waters back to Africa. All of it connected to acts of self-liberation. All of them represented Black agency in an environment where agency was stripped away in every possible fashion, where the slave-owning master class tried to remove all potential for Black agency. And so, flight can have multiple meanings, really, in terms of we see these various manifestations. We see flight in numerous contexts, and I love the connections to the spirituals. And I have to say, "I'll Fly Away," that's one of my favorite songs. But these themes, they show up over and over and over again in the musical tradition, in the literary tradition, in the artistic tradition, in the oral traditions. It is a constant running theme, and it is about liberation of one way or another, freedom, ultimate freedom.
We had a question just come in from an audience member. How do we move our community to historical African spiritual practices? Is there any way to decolonize our thinking and embrace our ancestral ways of thinking? Christianity has become so sectarian and we are self-sabotaging.
You know, our approach, and when I say our, we as people of African descent, um, just as one decides to embrace Christianity, or when that uh, clergy person asks, "Will you accept Yeshua," which is his real name, uh, as your Lord and Savior? And something within us, for those who said yes, you felt compelled to say yes. And you really cannot, you maybe cannot even explain or why you felt compelled. You know that you did. And so you said yes. And so when we talk about a return to our African spiritual practices, it even takes courage to do that, because most of us have been so ingrained with this Christianity, but that was the plan, to make us forget who we were, and to make us forget that we could once fly, and we forgot because that was the plan. Because in order for the slave master to have kept us in bondage, they first had to get us with this thing between our ears called our minds. And that's why my grandmother, Ms. Katie Brown, in that book, Drums and Shadows, would say that that is how we have been enslaved, through our minds. But I find it interesting that embracing this Christianity, and Dr. Giguere touched on it, we forget about the miracles that are laden all through this book called the Bible, and we forget that the book of Revelation says that in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, that we will be caught up. It sounds like they call it the rapture, but it sounds like the winds will take you up, and and it says that it will be as though you have wings. So, what do we really want to believe? Because to me, it seems like if you embrace Christianity, then we have to embrace all of this: the miracles, the turning water into wine, the being caught up, the flying, the walking on water, the dead will rise. All of these as stories, and they say they're stories, but some of us have had the privilege, the honor to have witnessed some of these miracles. But yet, if we were to speak it, oh, she's crazy, they're crazy, that's not true. And so I think in order to come out of your colonized mind, you really have to go deep within and do some deep soul searching. And it takes courage to say that I'm going to embrace my origins, which the Bible and all of those happenings are rooted and grounded in African traditions. Those are our stories that have been somehow changed, and to give us more of the European version than the original version.
As you were speaking, Bernadine, I was thinking about, during the Second Great Awakening, part of what made evangelicalism attractive to African Americans were the striking parallels between evangelical Christianity and many of the West African spiritual traditions. So, for example, the emphasis on the conversion experience, which involves being, taken by the Holy Spirit, that had, very clear parallels with spirit possession ceremonies and speaking in tongues, and the element of singing and dancing and constant movement and prayer and chanting, that so many of the qualities that accompanied evangelical revivals and revivalism, it was basically just a lateral move for so many people who came from West African religious traditions. And then to be told, this is a religion to be understood as a religion of the oppressed, it's a religion of spiritual liberation. It was easily translatable coming from a West African religious spiritual tradition to embrace the message of evangelicalism and then apply it to their lives. And we see that even with the embrace of evangelicalism, there's the ongoing persistence in many areas of the South of ongoing adherence to and applying older West African traditions, such as things like the ring shout and the decoration of graves with shells and glass and other objects. And I had another one and it flew right out of my head. But like I said, we see in many respects it's a lateral move. Oh yeah, and continuing even with adopting Christianity, continuing to believe in the sacredness of water and the return of souls to Africa, that there is an accommodation and a certain degree of syncretism involved in what becomes, the African American evangelical church or churches, where you have, the European evangelicalism kind of bleeding together with the older West African spiritual traditions. So it doesn't entirely go away. It isn't entirely colonized, but we do see, that they kind of smush together, and there are those accommodations that are made.
Mm-hmm. And and what you're saying, it, you're so spot on, because on Saplo, what happened was no one really converted to Christianity. They were brought up. Balali Muhammad and all of his 7 daughters and the rest of my family continued to practice Islam, but we were introduced to the Christian church. But as a result, the churches, the 3 Baptist churches on that island, they all face the east. The women sit on one side, the men sit on the other, as we do in the mosque. The women cover their heads when they enter into the church, as we do in the mosque. And so, the blending of the two, but continuing to, and that was a blessing within itself, to be able to continue to practice Islam. So I get what you're saying when that bleed, because that's definitely what happened.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think it is time for true freedom and liberation, is to go back to your roots, if you were separated from it, to find that courage to go back. And that's why spirituality is so personal. So
Uh-oh. Did she freeze?
something deep. I did. I saw it. But
You're
I
back.
get it. All am I back now? I'm
You're back.
sorry. Okay. So we have to find the courage to go back to our origin and to go back and embrace what I think we've been afraid to embrace, the fact that these miracles, they really aren't miracles. They really are everyday common occurrences, but somehow we lost that. Um, and we were told to forget that miracles only happen now, every now and again, rather than every day living in this. That is what true divinity is, to live in acknowledging that these things that we call miracles are just simply everyday common occurrences, even flying.
I was reading up through some of the comments and noticed one from actually my dad, um, who was quoting some statements from his parents, where his father would say, "My stories, truths with a little tail on it." And his mom would say, "Yeah, a long, tall tail." And he was saying it took quite a few renderings of this before the probable meaning took root. And we actually had a conversation earlier about the um, even with stories that were or narratives that were telling uh, either some harder truths or reworking some of the realities of things to share that narrative in a way that you had to come back to it. You had to um, go back and realize, oh, I missed this detail the first time I heard this, so that you would be called to come back and ask those clarifying questions or get to the heart of the story. And that sort of tradition in um, Black oral traditions. Um, to take that back to the flying African narratives, what stood out to me in reading many of the different accounts that were told, whether it was across the sea islands, narratives that were adapted in more modern tellings, where you're having the story told through direct it's given characters. So, for example, in Virginia Hamilton's version, I believe it's told through the perspective of an actual slave named, I believe, Eliza, and the older slave gentleman or enslaved gentleman um, who helped her rediscover that ability. But one thing that really stood out to me was the distinctions that were made between um, those who retained the ability to fly and those who were either born without it or lost it in that transatlantic voyage. Um, there's a very clear difference that's made in the story between those who could just up and fly away anytime they chose to. Narratives that talk about those who did it more than once. They got homesick, so they returned home, but they didn't want to leave their families here, so they came back. And those who forgot how to fly or who never had that power to begin with. Um, and Miss Brnadine, I'll start this question with you because I think you maybe have some of that same narrative knowledge of how these stories were told or how the narrative was told. Because one of the interesting differences that I saw in the narrative from the Caribbean was there's Zora Neale Hurston writes about these same narratives. And she says, those who ate salt had to stay in Jamaica and be slaves because they were too heavy to fly. And there's that distinction that now there's a choice involved. Now, because you accepted the salt of this new world, you're too heavy or you can't go back. So is that pointing to something in the narrative that is kind of an internal message, really, or a cultural message that's differentiating between those who never let go of those traditions and those abilities, those who forgot or were born without them because they were born away from where those traditions really had their root, and those who chose to give it up because they almost accepted the conditions that they were brought into.
Yeah, and it still stands today. That we're here, we're talking about this ability to fly, um, but it's the three levels of spirituality. Um, some people have embraced uh, or accepted whatever spiritual path, but they're limited in their thinking, and that's what we see in this in Christianity. Many Christians have not experienced the miracles um, that come along with, like, when we talk about the laying on of hands. Dr. Giguere talked about the speaking in tongues, and those are all the spiritual tools that can actually help you to regain that ability to fly. But most religions or denominations do not embrace those tools. So it is, we're seeing that some are limited, we're grounded, we have our wings, but we'll never fly because we're not using those tools to help us to fly. And then there are those who have those tools, and they maybe have not been fine tuned. And it's so deep. It is so deep. Um, to it just takes courage and much self-reflection to shake off the teaching that we are not able to fly, um, and to go back to our origins, and that's all that I know, and I've said that over and over again, but it really is just that simple. But changing that mind, it is the mind that keeps us grounded, that keeps most of us grounded. And so those new souls that day, um, with each generation after that, most of us got away from that. And that's when it did just become the narrative, because the deeper we got into trying to fit in this new way of life that we were being given, we forgot. And each generation now, we seem to be a little further away um, from 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 the traditions, from who we are.
Thank you so much. Dr. Giguere, as we wrap up, I want to come back to you for any closing thoughts that you have, or Anything more that you'd like to share as we wrap up the conversation tonight?
Thank you. As I sit and, I reflect on our conversation and the questions, and also just the work to try and present this material in a way and contextualize it and historicize it in a way that makes sense. In a way, at the end of this conversation, it's almost less clear than what I originally thought. Because, and I can only speak from the perspective of working historian, that, I think what it comes down to is we have to accept oral narratives for what they are. And we have to accept them like any other historical document and account, that this is evidence for people's experiences. These are pieces of evidence for people's identity and their history and what they know to be true. And while, there are many on the outside who may look in with an element of disbelief, that does not negate the verity of the truth of these narratives, of the traditions that they come from, and the personal experiences from which they spring. And rooting back to the original example of Eboes Landing, that alone should be addressed regularly in classrooms that talk about not just African American history, but American history, as an example, as a very profound example of Black resistance in the face of chattel slavery, that, captured and enslaved Africans did not just sit idly by and take what Europeans threw at them, but that they threw back with what was in their own toolkit of knowledge and methods for how to understand and engage with the world around them. And that was fundamentally different from how Europeans engaged with the world. And what we're ultimately looking at here is a clash of cultures where one is unwilling and unable to understand the lived experience and worldview from which their captives are coming from. So I suppose that will have to stand as my final comments. That, and thank you again so much for having me for another one of these dialogues.
Absolutely. We're so grateful for you joining us. And I really appreciate your statement that even though there's a lack of clarity, it's somebody put in the comments, you must unlearn what you have learned. And it is a process of, as we're looking at these narratives and as we're looking at the lived Black experience, we're inviting people to constantly be doing that work of unlearning whether it's colonized mindsets or recognizing the history that's been denied so many because it's not taught in schools or it's not brought up. Embracing the discomfort of realizing the things that we don't know, it's really important. So thank you for participating in the conversation with us tonight.
Thank you.
Ms. Brnadine, do you have any closing remarks?
I just have two, I think. First of all, a big, big thank you to Dr. Giguere. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for your courage in taking up topics like this and bringing it to students who would probably never know this. And so thank you for answering that call. The other thing is, in closing, that we are here this evening with Dr. Giguere because of my niece, Destiny Evans, who very recently came across this story, this history, this our story, and wanted very much for it to be a lived Black experience, community dialogue. So I am giving her her props. She is indeed the visionary for this evening's discussion. And so I thank her in her young mind, who is every day seeking to find out more of who she really is. And I am very grateful that one day the ancestors revealed themselves to her through this story. So thank you, Nisi. Thank you, Destiny. And I love you.
Well, thank you both. Thank you for joining in this conversation. Thank you to Destiny for bringing it forward as a topic. I mean, as you can see, and I hope our audience has seen, this is a deeply personal narrative, and one that speaks a lot to the lived Black experience, spanning beyond just these American shores. And connecting us back to our history beyond this place, and connecting the American narrative to that historic and ancestral knowledge. So it's a wonderful conversation, and I'm grateful to both of you for guiding us through this. To our audience, as always, I want to say thank you for participating. I want to give one more reminder, and we will keep reminding you through the end of this year, that these conversations are now being hosted on the Murdoch Center Facebook page, but soon we will be redirecting to the Live Black Experience Facebook page. So through the end of this year, we'll continue streaming here and cross-sharing to that page. But starting in January 2022, you'll want to make sure that you're following that page to ensure that you can continue seeing these conversations when we're having them live. Thank you again, Dr. Giguere, for joining us tonight, for sharing your wisdom and insights and learning alongside us. Thank you, Ms. Brnadine, for sharing your personal story and bringing your insights to this conversation as well. And again, as always, we say thank you to our audience. Everyone be well, be blessed, and be safe.
Go in grace.